Last but certainly not least, I have the pleasure of introducing our final speaker for our 2015 symposium, who I know we've had a lot of references today to boats and ships, but he really almost had to come via a boat or a ship. So we were very fortunate. Not only was he at the National Access Conference presenting yesterday, which caused him to get here late and be delayed getting here, we also are in the process of holding up his 2-week vacation. So
one week vacation.
So
1 week of watching a little.
So all of you are here, like just moments away from his vacation. So
no pressure.
So Michael Seereiter serves as the president and CEO of the New York State Rehabilitation Association, otherwise known as NYSRA, an organization that represents providers of services to individuals with varying disabilities throughout New York State. Prior to NYSRA, Michael worked for the New York State Office of Mental Health, where he served in 2 different capacities. Most recently as the Director of Planning, before that the administrator of the New York Make Works Pay program, a federally funded grant program led by New York State OMH supporting competitive employment opportunities and outcomes for New Yorkers with disabilities. Michael previously served as the Director of Mental Hygiene Services in the New York State Executive Chamber, with oversight responsibility for the agency serving people with psychiatric disabilities, developmental disabilities, and addiction treatment needs. Before joining the governor's office, Michael served as the Director of Public Policy for the Mental Health Association in New York State, playing a lead role in efforts to enact the mental health insurance parity law known as Timothy's Law, and legislation to ban the use of solitary confinement for prisoners with psychiatric disabilities. Prior to the Mental Health Association, Michael served as the legislative director for then New York State Assembly Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities Committee Chair Marty Luster. And on a personal level, Michael has a brother with Down syndrome, an experience he credits for helping drive him into this professional career, working on behalf of individuals with disabilities. Michael is the recipient of the 2015 Dr. Henry Viscardi Jr. Advocacy Award from the New York State Assembly, the 2010 Leela Salmon Advocacy Award from the Mental Health Association in New York State, and the 2010 Public Official of the Year Award from the New York State Rehabilitation Association. I have had the pleasure of seeing Michael in action in Albany, doing what he does best and much better at stalling than I am. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Michael Seereiter.
Thank you. So I have the distinct pleasure of being the last person to go. And I recognize where that what that means for me, which is to not replicate and duplicate where I can, but I unfortunately think I'm going to borrow from some of the themes we've already seen in some of the presentations today. Trust me, we did not coordinate these in advance, but I think you'll find some humor here, likely. First, a word about who we are, for those folks who are not familiar. We are an organization, a statewide trade association representing just over 80 organizations that provide varying services to people with disabilities. Our members range from the very, very small agencies to some of the largest human services agencies in the state. And the scope of their services are from either an exclusive developmental disability perspective to anything under the sun, essentially. And I think that the last piece that's important about NYSRA and its history is that we are an organization that I think has been grounded and it finds its roots, I guess, in these issues of employment and employment policy, dating back now several decades. An area that is still kind of bread and butter to us, very much a heart and soul issue, I guess, for the organization and many of what I believe the members of the organization expect from NYSRA. This presentation, I'm going to hit some of the larger points, I think, with some of the larger perspective I think I'm seeing taking place in the field now. I'll get into some of the weeds about some of the activities that NYSRA is involved with specifically, and then I'll try and bring it back up a few levels to talk about some of the larger challenges that I think are facing the field as a whole. So this is kind of my synopsis of where we are right now, which is trying to do too much too fast, which I think in general means that we don't do much of it well at all. Contrary to what Jason Helgerson was speaking about this morning, about a race forward, I feel like we are so bogged down in these details to try and get all of these details done all at the same time, that's a significant burden, to say the least, on providers across the board. The best example, I think, of this is the OPWDD transformation agenda. Again, just too much, too fast. We see the employment-related activities, transitions from sheltered workshops to other home and community-based services like supported employment, pre-vocational services, and the pathway to employment option. Obviously, there's also a push on the residential side, which most folks, I think, are familiar with as well, moving from ICFs to IRAs and other transitions there. And also, the third, I think, major piece of that transformation plan is the move to try to increase the number of people who self-direct their services. Then we also have, obviously, things like the Home Community-Based Services Community Rule. Again, a significant challenge to us as we try to figure out what that means. The pay for performance issue that we talked about with Jason, and some of which Mike talked about as well. The needs assessment transformation, including the move to the CAS at the OPWDD level, and the use of the inter-I, or development of a version of the inter-I at the Office of Mental Health, and obviously the care coordination piece of this. These are all policy changes that are taking place en masse all right now at the same time. And then at the same time, we also have so many changes about how providers are reimbursed and the reimbursement system reforms that are taking place. Again, OPWDD, I think, is the shining example here of rate rationalization and the chaos that I think that has frankly created for so many providers, being what we're on July 13th or 14th right now, or whatever we're at. And less than 2 weeks ago, we just implemented several changes in respite and supported employment and other programs, much of which providers are trying to navigate and figure out what does that mean to the way in which they continue to support people with a different funding mechanism and different requirements around that. Another example of that, obviously, is the OMH move toward home and community-based services and waiver-eligible services. A really good opportunity, but requires also these changes from provider perspectives on how they do business differently. We're teaching many of the mental health providers that have never billed for developmental disability services, waiver services before, what it means to be a Medicaid provider. And that's a challenge. That's a significant challenge for so many that we're seeing. And DSRIP, I think, is a great example, again, of that major rate reform and the way in which the reimbursement systems are being modified, that we are continuing to try to navigate. And of course, then we're going to move it all into managed care. And I'm not frankly sure what we're going to end up moving into managed care, because I'm not quite sure what's going to be left of what we have right now, or what the modifications of what's left after some of these changes take place. So 3 out of our 4 presenters today talked about the acronym issue that we have going on. And while I'm not necessarily trying to celebrate Christmas in July, I'll get on board with this as well. This is the logo that we put together for the NYSRA holiday card earlier this year, or actually late last year. And I think it quite still applies here. It really talks about the multitude of challenges that are taking place here. And as I think this illustrates, we really are trying to do it too much too fast. I don't think that we're adding additional things to that as well, some of which we're going to need to talk about, including a move to increase the minimum wage, which could place significantly larger challenges than those maybe we're even talking about right now, or have been talking about today, on providers. And obviously the OPWDD rate rationalization exercises continue this year, some of which are becoming more intense for some of the providers of services throughout the state. I'm likening this to a Bermuda Triangle. And it's a threefold kind of compression taking place in providers that I'm seeing. The first of which is in the inability to control the price at which we charge, if you will, for services, for providing services. That's Medicaid. Medicaid is the major payer for the vast majority of the services, or government otherwise is the major payer for those services. And the ability to change that is extremely challenged. The second aspect of that is around the control of the product, if you will, or the service, or the duration of the service that is provided, and the limitations that providers have on that front. And then the third aspect of this is in the control over the people that we hire to do the job, people that we can attract to do the job, the regulatory environment in which we find ourselves operating currently, which we talked about with Jason as well, and the constraints on administrative expenditures that this administration has also frankly put upon providers across, by and large across the field, with some exceptions. And from the problem here is that providers simply cannot do anything about any of these issues. These are places, providers essentially in the middle of this triangle. And I'm very concerned about what that means from an operation of a business to support people that we are mission-driven to support, but nonetheless, the constraints associated with trying to operate in that environment are so challenged. To continue the nautical theme, I kind of feel like that's what we're at, and it's kind of along the lines of what Steve Kroll was talking about in his initial comment to Jason. If you drown us, we won't be here. We won't be here to do these jobs. We won't be here to deliver these services. And I kind of feel like that while I like what I hear about Jason wanting to move forward several aspects to something that I think many of us like in theory, I'm not sure we can get there, quite frankly. And for some other reasons as well I'll talk about. So this is the logo for what we're calling the Insight Exchange that NYSRA recently rolled out, which is kind of essentially an umbrella around the way in which we're trying to couch the types of supports and services that we're providing to our members, if you will. And the tagline is what I'm going to use as a way to kind of walk through a few of the key issues that are so crucial to NYSRA right now. And that tagline is bridging policy, practice, and politics with curricula, conversations, and connections. The first thing I'll talk about is employment. Again, as I mentioned, this is bread and butter for NYSRA and NYSRA members as I see it. And the issue I think is important to talk about simply because of the importance of it itself. And I think employment from a non-monetary aspect of employment is probably the foremost important aspect of this issue. Because as anybody who's been in a social engagement before, probably most of you who participated in any of the events last night, the second question in almost any encounter that you have with anyone is such a crucial one. The first one is usually, hi, what's your name? Yeah. So what do you do? And people who are not employed and do not have things that they are value in their life and can talk about that are immediately ostracized from the conversation. And that sense of self-worth is so important and so crucial to individuals across the board, let alone just people with disabilities. The second aspect of this is indeed the economic self-sufficiency argument here. If we want to really talk about helping people make informed choices and that they make themselves, the best way in the society that we have, that we currently operate in, is to be able to buy that, to be able to make that possible with the resources that you have. The third aspect of this is that it really is a social determinant of health, which Jason talked about before. In fact, that's, I think, the reason that he put together the Medicaid redesign team work group on social determinants of health, focusing on this issue of employment across the board as such an important aspect to what the impact of it, the impact on the Medicaid system in particular. Which gets me to my fourth point, which is indeed it's a cost saver. When I was involved at the Office of Mental Health with the Medicaid Infrastructure Grant, which was mentioned before, we commissioned Cornell University to do a study of the Medicaid buy-in program for working people with disabilities. That program, by definition, has people with disabilities who are working in the program. And we looked at the Medicaid expenditures associated with individuals in that program versus individuals with disabilities not enrolled in that program. $73 per person per month. That's the savings associated with this. And we start to add that up of the entire population of people with disabilities who are currently working and many who are not currently working, we could have something significant to talk about here, likely in the hundreds of millions of dollars, which I would expect Mr. Helgerson would be interested in. So talking about employment from the policy, the practice, and the politics. Let's start, I guess, with get my notes, excuse me. Let's start with the policy issues. Major ones taking place on this front right now. Obviously, we have the transition from sheltered workshops to other new models, many of which have not yet been defined. We have the Home and Community-Based Services Community Rule. We have the Governor's Employment First Commission and the recommendations that came out, I guess that was earlier this year. It's been a busy year this year. That, thankfully, I think, were much more focused on incentivizing opportunities for competitive integrated employment than they were to try to take away opportunities that currently exist. And the last thing I would mention, I'll have to go back and look at it, is the Advisory Committee on Increasing Competitive Integrated Employment for Individuals with Disabilities, ACICIEID. Don't ask me to do that again. That is the committee that is looking at the Department of Labor's WELR implementation and has come out with draft recommendations just a couple days ago that recommends completely eliminating the 14C program, under which many individuals with developmental disabilities continue to work. Nonetheless, we haven't talked about an alternative. On the practice front of this, employment for people with disabilities has essentially remained stagnant and frankly at a deplorable level for decades. We have made essentially no significant changes in the competitive integrated employment rate for people with disabilities in decades. I think that that's indeed part of the stigma and the discrimination and the perspective that the communities have on people with disabilities. I also think that the 8,000 people who are currently continuing to rely on sheltered workshops and work centers are in a perilous position in many ways because that has served in part as a safety net for trying to find a competitive integrated job in the community. The last piece of this is that indeed I believe that competitive integrated employment for people with disabilities, despite these remarkably low rates of employment for people with disabilities, has simply not been a priority for any government, frankly, any administration in recent years. And we continue to face that as a problem, I guess. Providers are being asked, and that part of that transition from sheltered workshops to create new businesses that have not yet been defined, the risks for which have not yet been identified. I think that those are significant issues that we are facing as a field. And of course, the new OPWDD, as part of the great rationalization effort, the new OPWDD supported employment and pre-vocational services rates that were just essentially rolled out 2 weeks ago, I was alluding to before. Especially when we take a look at those rates in comparison to the comparable rates for supported employment and pre-vocational services that are going to be rolled out as part of the health and recovery plans from the Office of Mental Health as part of the new HCBS services there. Gross discrepancies here, quite frankly. We're looking at a $78 per hour rate associated with both of those services in the OMH world, and we're looking at a $64 to $55 rate in supported employment and a $43 to $41 rate for pre-vocational services on the OPWD front. For, I would argue, frankly, a population of individuals who, as across the board, likely face greater barriers to employment than the totality of the population in the OMH system. The last thing I'll mention on this is, of course, the politics of this. Jason mentioned this before, the CMS, OPWDD, DOH, I put relationship in big air quotes here. I think that the negotiating stance that the state of New York has had in discussions with OPWDD has been compromised, to say the least. Because of that issue that Jason was talking about, related to rates, related to reimbursement, and the federal share versus the state share, that kind of has painted the entire situation of how we find ourselves. In fact, I was having to explain that to members of Access at Access's Washington conference yesterday, trying to help understand why it is that New York is a special case, if you will. So, bridging the politics, the policy, and the practices with the curricula. Let's start with the curricula. NYSRA is focusing and trying to provide some significant technical assistance to providers of work center supports who need to make that transition according to the OPWDD transformation plan. And that technical assistance really, it was brought about as an opportunity from the Balancing Incentives Payment Program We applied for a grant, we got grant funding, and the grant funding is focused on bringing technical assistance to a targeted group of NYSRA members that we essentially identified through a request for interest process, finding us a good smattering, if you will, of folks across that 80 plus members to target technical assistance toward in helping them essentially build a business plan. That's the challenge that's been leveled at these providers to figure out what it is they're going to indeed do. So we're trying to provide them some of that technical assistance. First and foremost, I think, is an assessment of where they are, what they want to do, and what their needs would be to be able to get there. The electronic health record and the data systems aspects of this are so important. We're bringing some technical expertise to assist in the development of that and the coordination of that with some of the other activities that these providers are indeed engaged with. Accounting experience. This is probably my favorite example. When we're talking about businesses and the creation of businesses by not-for-profit entities, I think it immediately begs the question about whether this kind of an activity should remain under a 501c3 umbrella or whether it should be spun off as an LLC. It should be spun off as a separate for-profit entity. Because as I think many of us know, business in the United States of America is frankly a risky proposition. I think it's something in the neighborhood of that 50% of businesses fail. Well, if that remains as part of the 501c3 umbrella and the business fails, what is the liability of the provider of the services for the business associated with the liabilities of that business of the business enterprise that failed? That could actually essentially tank. I could see many providers that may not have a successful first go at it in relation to creating a business. Linkages with local workforce development expertise, looking at some of the trending data to help us figure out where we indeed might be able to find opportunities. Assistance in engaging both individuals and family members of individuals working in work centers. There is obviously, as we all know, great resistance to much of what has been much of which has been presented by OPWD. We need to find a way to channel that into a productive way for this conversation around what that change is going to mean for the provider and how family members and individuals can be helpful as part of that transformation. If we can find that business plan, I think that would be helpful here. And as the last piece of this is indeed small business development expertise, bringing people together, trying to tap into some of the existing resources that have been focused primarily on for-profit entities, but now we have the opportunity to tap into some of that now with this opportunity. As I mentioned before, the goal of this is to create plans, to create business plans, and business plans that really need to be viable. My expectations of this process are mixed. I think we're going to see some providers indeed find a business plan that is indeed viable. I also think that we're going to see some providers in this process that are going to find a business plan that they cannot make as a viable one, that we need to probably bring back to help inform our advocacy efforts, to help inform the transformation process. As someone had talked about before, some of these are just going unrealistically fast. I think Mike was talking about that. To come back and inform that process, despite some significant technical assistance brought to bear on a particular provider and helping them make that transition, we're nonetheless still at ground zero. We need some more time, we need some more resources. If indeed a transformation like this is actually going to be successful at all. This is a video clip we're going to play just to talk about the experience of some of the folks who are participating in this technical assistance opportunity we're bringing forth through the NYSRA Transformation Project. Go ahead.
Sir, for Brooklyn Community Services. Well, we're in the middle of a huge transition. I would say we're in the middle of the beginning of a huge transition. All of our programs that are funded by OPWDD, we are re-looking at how we deliver services, at how to best help people to be active members of the communities in which they live. And this opportunity to support us in our thinking is something that we really need. We need expertise. We want to learn from folks who've been there before us and will hopefully help us to avoid big potholes. We need so much change going on in the agency itself. Additional pairs of eyes to make sure that we are coloring within the lines as we make change to things that for us completely new and never been done before, but possibly out there, as I'm hearing now, have been done by others. So how can we lean on the support of others so that we can grow strong, well, and quickly? I think we're expected to be change agents.
It's going to load. We can cut it. It's okay. You're getting the gist. People need some help, and that's exactly what we're trying to do here, is bring some help to them. So moving on, I guess, to some of the other areas, we have the conversations and the connections to talk about this also on the employment front. Let's start with conversations. Our transformation project, I believe, is serving as part an opportunity for conversations of collaboration, if you will, amongst peers, trying to figure out what's working, because as Janelle was suggesting, as I think in part of her testimonial here, that we're inventing it as we go along, and we need to kind of learn from one another as we go through that process. I think that's increasingly, frank, as an aside, I'm finding that's an increasingly important role for NYSRA and other associations, is serving as the forum for these kinds of conversations, because no one has the roadmap, despite Jason having the roadmap. No one has the roadmap. No one knows the plan. We are literally figuring this out as we go, and we're figuring out so many things all at the same time. It's so easy to let important details slip by. NYSRA's created an employment council that serves as a kind of our hub for conversations around all these issues, whether it's Access VR supports, or OMH supports, OPWDD supports, across the board. A couple of the outcomes of that most recent meeting actually, was a letter to DOH and OPWDD pointing out those discrepancies in the rates for supported employment and pre-vocational services that I mentioned before. We're supposed to engage in a conversation on that shortly. And I think that this is going to be the forum at which we're going to convene members to be able to essentially compare notes on this transformation of supported employment and pre-vocational services that just took place with OPW, to find out how it's going. Are we keeping our heads above water, or are we not? And this will inform the advocacy efforts that NYSRA takes up on behalf of individuals. And last thing I would mention, two things here. NYSRA's white paper that was issued last year around this time, Paul Cezanne was particularly helpful to me in helping me sort through and lay out a salient argument about why we should indeed be trying to build capacity before we take away capacity, which we still have such a long road to go on that front. And I think, as we mentioned before, the ACI, CI, EID, and the threats to 14C that I think that poses here are significant for our continued efforts to support people with employment goals who may not be able to, or we have thus far not been able to help secure a competitive integrated job. Connections front. This is, we're trying to make some of these connections, I think, which are really important to this, facilitating many of those connections on the WIOA opportunity with our colleagues at NIATEP, the New York Association of Training and Employment Professionals, who we have a great relationship with and are trying to jointly teach our members what each other know about what's going on with this transformation that's taking place. The leadership role that NYSRA plays with the Inclusive Workforce Alliance is a particularly important one, I think. We are the co-leaders, along with the New York Association of Psychiatric Rehabilitation Services, of a 21-organization, association organization alliance, if you will, that is likely to be the body that is the advisory body, I guess is the right word, for the governor's Employment First plan and the recommendations coming out of that. And the last thing I would mention here is also the development of an interesting relationship with Disability Rights New York, the new P&A advocacy organization. that has oversight of services and supports for people with varying disabilities. They're very interested in particularly the issue related to supported to sheltered workshops. I think less from a perspective of providers and more from a perspective of whether government, particularly OPWDD, is providing sufficient resources and ample opportunity to make an appropriate transition, or whether we're indeed going to leave people stranded who want to have a work opportunity but are no longer able to have that because of the policy decisions that have been made. So moving on. Number 2 on my list is managed care. This is obviously something we've been talking about today. Let's start with the politics of this. I think that's probably the most appropriate place because this is essentially driven in part through a political process that this governor implemented back in 2011, I believe that was, right? For a move to managed care for all as part of this Medicaid redesign team, and the Medicaid redesign team's recommendation to move to that. On that policy front, indeed, that's what we're dealing with, is that care management for all. From my perspective, I think that this seems like a good opportunity for the mental health world, but we've yet figured that out from that bigger perspective for the DD population, I believe. Health homes, I think, is a good example of that. As Mike Hogan was talking about before, I think it's been an okay experience thus far, and while we've increased caseloads, we've not necessarily improved outcomes, in part because we haven't well defined those outcomes. And I think that also plays to a significant deficit for the developmental disabilities realm is the creation of or the development of those outcomes. And of course, the OPWDD transformation panel is a major piece of all of this policy discussion of where we're going to go on the managed care front in the DD world. From the practice perspective, this is a process that requires the use of sophisticated outcomes. I believe that we have an incredible amount of work to do. That's why I was pushing Jason in the comment I made back to him about moving immediately to that level 3 value-based payments process. I don't believe we've done the work. We've done the hard work necessary to be able to define what those outcomes are and quantify those outcomes across the board to be able to make that a meaningful exercise for us to move to that level this quickly. And doing so requires the use of these very sophisticated tools, some of which have indeed been developed. I think the Council on Quality and Leadership, CQL, provides a good model here that we can build upon. I think we are doing more of that. But the problem, I think, here is that indeed some of the providers are struggling with multiple initiatives, the alphabet soup, once again, of initiatives that all require some type of investment on this front. On the practice front, OMH has essentially been in a practice mode on managed care for over 3 years with behavioral health organizations implementation, which I think has been a really good learning experience, and I think we need to take that into consideration also for the DD field, that we have a lot to learn. And frankly, despite the learning experience, still we have providers who are struggling with being prepared for that transition when that's going to take place, theoretically, in just a few short months, as I mentioned. So on the conversations front, I guess, let's start there. NYSRA and NYSRA have been collaborating for the past few years in the production of a Community Integration Leadership Institute, which we hosted in June of last year and June of this year. That has served as a really good opportunity for providers to get together and for providers to engage with the policymakers that are involved in these policy decisions. Our Managed Care Council that we've been working on for close to a year as well begins later this month. I think is going to be the place that this kind of conversation is going to take place for providers to learn from one another on the managed care front and what is working or not working. As it says here, a forum for sharing information, but I think that also helps us figure out what technical assistance needs the provider community has and helps very much shape our public policy advocacy efforts on that front. Obviously, we've been involved, like Steve Kroll and others have been involved in the OPWDD transformation panel. I think that this begs a few questions, and our conversations have helped us bring about some of these questions with policymakers. First of one, a couple granular ones here I think I'll mention. The managed care shift, would that provide flexibility that would provide some relief from the 15-minute billing increment process that we're billing increments and documentation process that we're moving toward. That was, again, the thrust of my question to Jason, which was we seem to be moving in opposite directions versus toward where he wants us to get. The question about whether there's a carve-out, as our previous speaker was talking about, is appropriate or not, or is it even an option to think about for the DD habilitative supports. And the last piece I would mention here is the creation of, it's the optional enrollment here, I think, is a question that could be something to think about, because as OPWD starts to talk about and model these things, they identify a small cohort of people who they believe could move to different environments that also would be cheaper environments, which would then be money to reinvest in system change. But how do we get people, how do we incentivize the right people to sign up for a voluntary DISCO enrollment if indeed it's just such a small cohort, and to find those savings that they believe that can happen here. And on the connections front here, identifying expertise with people who have managed care readiness has been a huge piece of what we've been working on recently, trying to bring some of that expertise to members as a whole. Building relationships also with the PPS leads as part of the district exercise, I think has been a really great opportunity here to learn from folks doing other things that we need to be connecting with, is exactly what, as Jason has been talking about. And on the curricula front, I expect that some of these activities are going to bring about a greater understanding of what the technical expertise, technical assistance needs are of providers in the field. The last piece of our focus, the last area of our focus, relates to data. And you'll also see that this is probably the most sparsely populated section of this PowerPoint, and frankly yet to be developed area of our advocacy and our efforts. And frankly, this is the problem. If we are unwilling to go here, and I think most people are now, have understood the power of this, I believe that this is probably the outcome. We won't be around in a few years if we don't embrace this. For those folks who are unwilling to, that will never happen. They won't just simply make it. The question is whether we're going to be able to adapt and build the systems that we've been talking about are necessary to quantify the types of outcomes that we want to see in a way that's meaningful in that managed care construct, and frankly, from a larger government contracting perspective. Which brings me, I guess, to the politics, the policies, and the practice. The demands on government for increased accountability are appropriate. We've been saying that we do good things for good people for a long time. We do need to do that. And as contractors to government, if you will, we have a responsibility and a participation in that, obviously. From the policy perspective, the government funding, especially through the managed care, is going to demand a demonstration of value, as we've been talking about here. And from a policy advocacy perspective, policymakers are not really willing to engage with us any longer unless we bring meaningful data to them, if you will, to help better understand that. The anecdotal experiences are simply insufficient from a policy perspective now. On the practice front, I think that there's a high recognition of the need in the field for moving in this direction. I think the question is whether we can get there. There's wide variability in the capacity of providers. The providers that I think are large and involved in multiple things here are struggling with how to make those investments in the targeted places where they need to make them within the timeframes that have been outlined. And the small providers are frankly struggling to get started, find the resources to be able to make that dedication, to make that investment. The last piece of this I will talk about, which I said before, is that I think we're really in the beginning stages of this ability to quantify, particularly the benefits of the habilitative supports that I think are the crux of many of the folks that are certainly NYSRA members, and that I think drive so many of the health outcomes that people with developmental disabilities and psychiatric disabilities are impacted by. Let's see if I can find my notes. lost myself in my notes, I apologize. From the curricula front here, we're trying to indeed explore the possible creation of a data warehouse that would help quantify this, indeed, for particularly the habilitative supports, as I believe if we don't do this work, if we are not the one to create the systems that define what these supports are and the value that they add, that will be defined for us and frankly imposed on us. I think that's a crucial role that we need to play in the definition and the creation of those data points, if you will. Identifying technical expertise in data in the data and analytics development is a key piece of this. Finding the right people to advise us and help us build those systems. As Mike Hogan was talking about, there's consultants for everything, and certainly trying to find the right consultant at the right time, I think, is a major challenge at this point. And that we're trying to indeed seek individual provider agency data from the Department of Health, like that which was presented at our Community Integration Leadership Institute back in June. I think these two slides are particularly demonstrative of, indeed, the power of the data. Now, we'd like to see this kind of data provided on a provider-specific front. This is a slide that Dr. Doug Fish from the Department of Health, I'm not sure if he's in Jason's shop or not, I can't remember, presented at our conference, and I think is really demonstrative of the overutilization of both the inpatient and the emergency room utilization in the behavioral health and developmental disabilities populations. Here's the second slide. You can simply see the outlier. It's blatantly there. The question in my mind is, how do we quantify the value of the habilitative supports that avoid these kinds of outcomes and this kind of data that Jason is so focused on driving down. And first of all, we need to get to know that data ourselves. And I think that's a significant challenge for providers. I think that they have much of that data available, but it is not presented in a way that helps them understand the larger value of this, and where they fit into the larger picture. I think Dishert will be particularly helpful in this front, actually, where they're talking about the development of these individual data sharing systems that will help providers, like NYSRA members, understand all of the other people who touch those people that they serve. That's going to be a first major step here toward creating the conversation that Jason was talking about, to say, okay, now what do we want to do about these people who we see these kinds of outcomes that we want to see as different? What are we going to do about that? The last pieces of this I'll talk about quickly. On the conversations front, we're indeed trying to do that through a work group that we've created now over a year ago, and trying to get up and operational to help guide us in part in that process. We're looking for collaborative learning. We're looking to create a collaborative learning environment. An example that was given to me a couple of years ago now, when we were talking about this from, I can't remember where I was at the moment, frankly, was the example of the obstetricians, the OBGYNs, getting together 35 or 40 years ago and sharing their data. They were so reluctant to do so, but they would get together, they'd meet like quarterly or once a year or whatever it was, and they would share their data, and they'd spreadsheet it out, and there was always this one guy who was an outlier. Always, every single year, every single quarter, always he's the outlier with these exceptional results. And they kept asking him, what do you do differently? He's like, I don't know, this is what I do. And he explained his process and da-da-da-da-da. They ended up sending an entire cohort up to northern Maine, where he practices, to watch him do the procedure. And they ended up sitting down, sitting there in the observation room, watching him do a procedure, and they all kind of yell out at the same time, wait, what was that? What did you just do right there? What was that? And it was one small procedure, one small action that drove this entire different level of results for the benefits for the individual, for the mom, and for the child. And as soon as the others started to emulate that, they all started to come up here and see this kind of an outcome. We need to create an environment that's a safe environment for us to share that kind of data and to learn from one another. On the connections front, I think that this is, we need to be trying to find opportunities to help in the financial department, if you will, to make these kind of investments. I think that's going to be a key piece of this, pointing people to the resources that might be available. And frankly, not reinventing the wheel. Great conversation just a week or two ago with Steve and folks at NYSRA about some of their efforts. We don't have time to reinvent the wheel or recreate a wheel. We are we are already far behind the 8 ball on this front. So those are our 3 areas of focus, if you will. Let's bring this back up to larger levels. Some of the other questions that we're talking about and thinking about that I think have a significant impact on our ability to make it to where Jason's vision is of the future. The first of which is the one we see in the newspapers and I think is consuming most of the oxygen in Albany right now, is around the minimum wage. The governor has proposed as part of the governor created as part of his effort to raise the minimum wage, a wage board that is currently looking at an increase up to $15 an hour for people in the fast food industry, but people in the fast food industry only. The impact of which I think would be considerable on providers of services. The average starting salary in the DD field right now is $10.50 an hour, I believe it is, and the average salary across the board for direct support professionals in the DD field is about $12.75. If they were to be talking about a $13 or $14 or $15 minimum wage, I think we have a considerably large problem on our hands, and especially given some of the constraints and some of the pressures that are on direct support professionals, not the least of which are things like the Justice Center. Likewise, we also have a significant threat taking place here, I think, with the President's proposal and regulations to require that anyone making less than essentially $50,000 a year be paid mandatory overtime for any hours in excess of 40 hours a week. The problem with both of these proposals is that the providers of services, at least in the fields that NYSRA is involved with, the payers of those services is indeed government, and government then needs to pay its fair share, frankly, if they want to see this kind of an outcome. If the governor wants to see an increase in the minimum wage, that means he needs to increase reimbursement. We're talking about billions of dollars here on that front. And likewise, it needs to take place at the federal level with relation to the President's proposal around salaried employees. The fact that many of the providers of services within the NYSRA network are more than 90% funded through public funds, that demands that government plays a role, the role in making that happen. From a provider sustainability perspective, I question the ability of providers we have been talking about and questioning the ability of providers to support individuals after some of the policy and reimbursement changes have indeed taken place and may be found unsustainable. I think we can see that with the OPWDD transformations, the OPWDD rate changes. Another question that we've been talking about, particularly, I'm circling that or writing it down somewhere earlier, one of the other presenters was talking about this, but are larger organizations better suited to provide the kind of highly individualized and personalized services that are being demanded by government, which I think that what I was noting was that requires high degrees of flexibility and high degrees of nimbleness to be able to navigate in a changing environment. Larger organizations, simply by nature of the fact that they are larger organizations, have a more difficult time making quick changes. And the move toward managed care is the district incentive big enough, essentially, to overcome what I believe is a incentive created by the Justice Center and frankly, the system as a whole toward risk aversion is the financial incentive provided by district, which comes out to roughly $200 per Medicaid recipient over the period of the 6-year demonstration. Is the $200 sufficient to be able to get a provider of services to say, yeah, I know that the person said that they had that they had chest pains, but we're going to send them to the hospital anyway. To make that a different decision, to have that nurse come in and check that person out, whatever it may be. That's actually been my personal experience 3 times now. I think it's 3 times. My brother has been taken by ambulance to the emergency room after saying that he has chest pains. Well, the chest pains immediately followed a arguably larger than appropriate spaghetti and meatballs dinner that caused him to have, well, yes, chest pains. And that's the way he expresses that. But whenever those words were said, immediately, we got to get him to the hospital, get him checked out, make sure. Getting back to this issue of the Medicaid buy-in program for working people with disabilities at $73 per person per month. I do question about the additional costs that are going to be borne by the Medicaid system by people who may no longer be able to maintain an employment opportunity based on some of the policy decisions and rate decisions that have been made. And the last piece I would mention here is, are we about to embark on what might be a first failure of managed care in the DD field? Getting back to this issue of data, getting back to this issue of quantifiable outcomes. I believe we have a great deal of work to do on that front, and without some significant more work, I guess, on that, I would beg the question about its feasibility. A couple of recommendations, I guess. I think you're going to see themes from what we saw before. Communication, and communication particularly with one another. I think we can learn from one another by creating better lines of communication amongst providers. I think that's really important. We need to look at each other as cousins, as related rather than competitors. That's a really important piece of this. Sharing with colleagues the best practices that have been identified, and also pointing to the pitfalls and sometimes the cliffs that have been encountered. We need to learn what it is indeed. For example, our colleagues at FEGS in New York City went through what caused the demise of that organization. What is it that we can learn from that process and avoid a similar fate? A third piece of this, again, is data collection. It is gigantic. And part of the struggle that we at NYSRA are having is, we know we need to start, it's just the where do we start and how do we start? We know we just need to start. But where? And how do we do it in a way that's meaningful? I think we're getting close to something on that, but providers across the board need to be doing it. If they're not, they need to start immediately. Acting like a business. We're increasingly moving into a business-like environment, if you will, and that's a very difficult proposition, I think, for many of the providers that are in particularly the developmental disabilities and behavioral health worlds. It's one of the reasons that families like mine so love the provider of services that supports my brother, because they will do anything to support that individual. They believe that's part of their mission. Yet what we find ourselves in is an environment in which the decisions are being made by others that place providers in a financially precarious position, a newfound financially precarious position in some cases, that simply means some lines of business and some lines by which we support people are no longer viable. And the question in my mind is how long providers will continue to try to support that despite it being an operating deficit. And at what point will they either say we can no longer do this, or will it indeed just break the bank? And the last piece of this is kind of what I got to before, that rather than competing, it may be wiser to collaborate here. I think that's increasingly an environment in which we're moving. One observation from Jason's presentation, which maybe we'll start to kick off some of the Q&A I think is likely to follow here next. He talked about removing silos. And I was struck by that because we've heard it 1,000 times, and he talked about it kind of like we need to bring these things together. My feeling on this is that to be able to be successful in that, we need to trust that the new environment is going to be at least as good at meeting the needs and understanding the complexities of the challenges that these systems and the individuals in these systems rely upon. And quite frankly, every time Jason said patient, I cringed. Patient. When, at least from NYSRA's perspective, the vast majority of the supports that are provided by our members are habilitative, day-long supports, day improvement supports, life improvement supports. There's nothing sick. The people that we serve are often just not sick. They need support in their life. And the more that is reinforced of a medical model, the less, frankly, I trust the ability to put this together. That scares me. Quite honestly, it just scares me. But back to Mike's point about the fact that we've held that for so long. We've owned it. So, yeah, maybe Jason just doesn't know, and maybe we need to share it with him so that he can learn it. It's a challenging position for us to be in. when we are, I think, in such a challenged environment. But so that's it. Thank you.
Questions for Michael? I have one. It's not related to managed care, but the Resource Center has been very successful in the last couple of years. The Resource Center has been very successful in the last couple of years, providing supports and services to people who want to self-direct their lives. But one of the areas that we have not been quite as successful is employment. People self-directing their employment services. So I know you kind of hear a little bit of everything from all of the services from different providers. So I just wanted to find out if you've been hearing some challenges that other service providers are talking about in terms of providing self-directed services in employment specifically.
I don't have anything specific on this. I don't have anything specific to share there, other than that. That's one of the things that we continue to hear, including as part of the discussions that take place with the transformation panel. We talk about wanting to get more people competitive integrated jobs, but and Clint Perrin from the Self-Advocacy Association of New York State, which probably some folks know, continues to remind us that we need to make sure that that fits into the self-direction model. But frankly, I think there's a great deal of work to be done on that front. I'm not sure that there are great. I don't have any great examples to share, unfortunately. Sorry.
But it's not just us.
No, not at all. I think many people are struggling with that. It's exactly what I think. Exactly what I think is going on. I think many people are struggling exactly with that.
That's cute. Before I let Michael sit down again, but does anybody have any other questions for Michael before he... The Resource Center is long-standing members of NYSRA. We gain a lot from our relationship with them, so we were very fortunate to have Michael join us today. Your passion for employment for those people with disabilities are near and dear to us. We very, very much appreciate NYSRA's advocacy efforts on behalf of provider agencies like ourselves, but more importantly, individuals with disabilities that we support every day. So it's very helpful to hear that we're not alone in some of the challenges and some of the things that